Telek adjusted the translation matrix while a trillion viewers waited for the human to kneel. The trillion-voice amphitheater hummed with the latent thermal energy of a galactic apparatus preparing to flex. Ambassador Whitlock Sarada of Earth walked into the center ring. It would be 14 hours before the broadcast concluded. She wore standard diplomatic charcoal, but against her collarbone rested a thin silver chain bearing absolutely no pendant, a meaningless void of an adornment in a room obsessed with heavy ceremonial medallions. The holding pen below the main dais offered no physical restraints. None were required. A localized gravity shear kept the subject species anchored exactly 3 meters from the primary broadcast lens. Telek Vorin wiped a bead of condensation from his primary interface panel. 19 years directing the Unified Information Bureau had taught him that the visual narrative was established in the first 60 seconds. He keyed the master control. Booth 3 tightened the focal length on the human, Telek muttered into his headset. Give me isolation. I want the scale of the amphitheater pressing down on her shoulders. Drop the ambient lighting in quadrant 4. Below them, Speaker Varmask Theln ascended the dais. The cetacean humanoid stood 2.4 meters tall, his iridescent skin already shifting to the deep, bruised purple of rehearsed righteous anger. He wore the mantle of the 100. The heavy ceremonial robe was stitched from a thread donated by every signatory species of the compact, a literal tapestry of 4 millennia of unbroken hegemony. He carried the staff of convocation lightly in his right hand. The ambassador stood perfectly still. She looked up at the dais. She smiled. A soft chime pinged in Telek's left ear. Booth 3's behavioral analysis subroutine had flagged the microexpression. The text scrolled across Telek's peripheral monitor, subject expressing discomfort under pressure. Telek nodded slowly. He noted professionally that the subject had expressed discomfort earlier than most. Usually, the lesser species waited until the first list of infractions before their composure slipped. I'll be honest. What I saw on that feed changed everything I thought I knew about power. Stay close. The speaker raised his staff. The crystal tip caught the ambient light, refracting it into 100 localized laser points that swept the amphitheater's tiered seating. The amphitheater itself was empty of physical attendees, save for the honor guard. The audience was digital. 1.2 trillion citizens across 100 worlds were tuned into the synchronized feed. Citizens of the Compact, the speaker began. His voice resonated through 3 distinct vocal apertures along his throat. The right aperture, damaged decades ago, caught slightly on the upper register, producing a faint, off-key harmonic that Telek quickly smoothed out in the audio mix. We gather to witness the correction of the Terran anomaly. Telek leaned back in his acceleration chair. The demand cycle had officially begun. This was the easiest part of the broadcast. For the next 4 hours, the speaker would meticulously enumerate humanity's offenses against coalition law. He would list unauthorized colonial expansions. He would list unregistered technological developments. He would list the sheer, staggering arrogance of attempting to negotiate bilateral trade agreements without compact oversight. Hour 1 passed in a wash of theatrical acoustics. The low, static hum of the translation matrix warming up beneath Telek's console vibrated through his boots. Down in the ring, the ambassador had not moved. She had not shifted her weight. She had not reached into her pocket for a datapad to take notes. She simply stood, hands clasped loosely in front of her, listening to the systematic dismantling of her species' legal right to exist in deep space. Telek found himself watching her hands. Most subjects fidgeted. Some wept. The defiant ones glared, burning up their adrenal reserves in the first 90 minutes until exhaustion forced their heads down. The ambassador did none of these things. At the 2-hour mark, the speaker reached the section regarding Earth's refusal to integrate their agricultural logistics into the Central Compact Registry. He raised his volume. the off-key resonance threatening to overwhelm the audio filters. Telec's fingers danced across the haptic sliders, suppressing the audio artifact. The ambassador reached up. She touched the blank silver chain at her throat, just once, a light tap of the index finger against the metal. Another chime from booth 3. Nervous pacing tell, motor function leak. Telek frowned. He dragged the camera feed to his secondary monitor, blowing up the resolution on her face. Her breathing was slow, rhythmic, measured. The telemetry from the floor sensors indicated a resting heart rate that had not elevated a single beat per minute since she walked into the room. She smiled again. The expression was identical to the first, measured, warm, fractionally too long to be an involuntary reflex. It sat on her face like a polite response to a mildly amusing joke told at a dull reception. Composure failure, the behavioral log updated. Subject attempting inappropriate social masking. Booth 3, Telek said, his voice dropping an octave. Check your biometric sensors. Are we getting interference from the gravity shear? Negative, Director Voron, the technician replied. Sensors are clean, she's just suppressing. Telek tapped his index finger against the edge of his console. He stopped narrating the broadcast in his head. Against all protocol, he stopped watching the speaker. He pinned the primary camera on Ambassador Whitlock Sarada. Something was wrong with the visual composition. The framing was designed to make her look small, isolated, and crushed by the weight of a trillion eyes. Instead, she looked like a woman patiently waiting for a rainstorm to pass so she could finish planting a garden. The amphitheater air recyclers cycled with a heavy, sulphurous sigh. Hour 3 blurred into Hour 4. The speaker's skin had shifted from purple to a mottled, aggressive crimson. He was sweating. The physical toll of projecting authority onto a blank wall of a human was beginning to show. He struck the staff of convocation against the dais, the sharp, rhythmic thump echoing through the chamber. These are the crimes, the speaker bellowed, his voice straining. This is the debt. The compact requires submission. The compact requires the knee. The demand had been spoken. The protocol script dictated a brief pause, a heavy silence designed to let the word knee hang in the minds of a trillion viewers. Telek held the camera on the ambassador. The silence stretched. It became heavy. It became brittle. Ambassador of Earth, the speaker said, his tone dripping with weaponized magnanimity. The ceremonial allowance permits a single response. You may address the bidirectional channel. You may beg the compact for leniency. The bidirectional channel, Telek nearly scoffed. It was an archaic piece of broadcast architecture, a leftover from the founding days 4 millennia ago when member worlds actually conversed during treaties. Now it was ceremonial residue. Every feed was bidirectional in theory, but in practice, the 100-member worlds only ever received. No one had broadcast back in 3,000 years. The ambassador unfolded her hands. She looked directly into the primary broadcast lens. Telek felt a sudden, irrational cold sweat pool on his palms against the glass of his display. She did not kneel, she did not beg. I thank the speaker for his comprehensive historical review, Whitlock Sarada said. Her voice was terrifyingly pleasant. It did not echo. It simply cut through the manufactured acoustics of the room. And I accept the ceremonial allowance of the bidirectional channel. Telek wiped a smudge off his primary monitor with his thumb. He prepared to cue the standard auditory dampeners for a weeping apology. However, she continued, I do not require the time. I yield my response to the delegate from the Kesari Republic. Silence slammed into the amphitheater. It was not a ceremonial pause. It was a vacuum. Telek froze. The speaker froze, his staff halfway raised for a triumphant strike. In booth 3, a technician dropped a half-empty ration cup. The plastic clattered loudly against the deck plating. Down in the amphitheater, the main holographic display behind the dais suddenly fractured. The massive, unified seal of the 100 Worlds Compact pixelated, tore in half, and was replaced by a live feed from a poorly lit room on a planet 3 systems away. A Kesari delegate filled the screen. The slender insectoid adjusted its posture, its segmented thorax clicking audibly. "The Kesari Republic," the delegate stated, its voice translated flawlessly through the system Telic had spent hours tuning, "recognizes that the compact no longer represents us. We withdraw our signature from the charter." The feed held for 3 seconds. Then the amphitheater display cut back to the compact seal. Telic's console exploded with red proximity warnings. The internal comms channel turned into a wall of screaming static. Protocol officers in the tier below the booth were running, their boots hammering against the metal grates. "Cut the feed," a senior protocol officer shrieked over the comms. Vorin cut the bidirectional channel. She hijacked the line. Telic's hands flew over the haptic board. He triggered the sever command. The system returned a soft, polite denial chime. He slammed the manual override. "Denied." "I can't," Telic breathed, his professional detachment fracturing. "It's hard-coded into the amphitheater's base architecture. As long as the subject has the floor, the bidirectional channel remains open. It's ceremonial law." "Then mute her." "She isn't speaking," Telic yelled back, the smell of burning ozone wafting from his overtaxed console as it tried to process the massive influx of unscheduled data. Down on the floor, the ambassador stood in the exact same position. She had not moved. "This is an outrage," the speaker roared, recovering his voice, though it cracked severely on the upper register. "The Earth ambassador makes a mockery of." The holographic seal tore again. A new feed stabilized. A heavily scarred mammalian delegate from a mining colony on the outer rim stared into the lens. "The Vorley Coalition," the delegate rumbled, "recognizes that the compact no longer represents us. We withdraw." The seal returned. The speaker was visibly trembling. His iridescent skin flushed a sickly, pale green. Telic stared at the data cascading down his secondary screen. The telemetry wasn't a glitch. The ambassador's 3-month informational tour prior to this ceremony. The meetings with planetary governors and labor chairs. It hadn't been an apology tour. It had been a synchronization check. She had been lining up the broadcast queue. A third visual feed overrode the main seal, an aquatic delegate floating in a suspension tank. "The Pelagic Union withdraws." The protocol officers were physically slamming their fists against the reinforced glass of Booth 3 now, demanding Telic perform a miracle. He ignored them. He watched the ambassador. She was looking up at the terrified speaker. She wasn't gloating. She wasn't triumphant. She looked exactly like a woman who had politely asked a question and was simply waiting for the final, inevitable answer. The broadcast feed was still live. 1.2 trillion citizens were watching, and Telic Vorin, staring at his locked console, realized with absolute, crushing certainty that he could not close the channel because she had not finished yielding it. A fourth visual feed sliced through the primary display, shattering the speaker's enormous holographic face into jagged digital shards. Telic backed away from his master console. The heavy security door to Booth 3 buckled inward. A senior protocol officer slammed his shoulder against the reinforced frame a second time, his mandibles clicking wetly against the glass pane. "Override the core matrix," the officer screamed through the intercom. "Pull the physical data cables if you have to." Telic stared at the frantic bureaucrat. He did not touch the cables. The routing architecture was buried beneath 3 meters of solid Durasteel decking. You could not unplug a broadcast system built to withstand an orbital bombardment. The Earth ambassador had not simply found a backdoor. She had used the front door, propped it open with a 4,000-year-old law, and invited the entire galaxy inside. The fourth delegate spoke. It was an avian representative from the high-gravity world of Kaelin. Rustling, metallic feathers scraped against their microphone. The Kaelin roosts recognize our sovereignty over the compact. We withdraw. Down on the dais, Speaker Varmosk Thelm completely abandoned the ceremonial script. He swung his staff of convocation through the air. The resonating crystal tip flared bright yellow. He bellowed into his primary vocal apertures, trying to drown out the delegates with sheer acoustic force. The amphitheater's audio processors shrieked in protest. "Treason," Thelm roared. "This is an illegal disruption. The Terran anomaly will be classified as a hostile biologic agent. The fleet will burn your agricultural centers." His voice was terrifying. It was also entirely localized. The amphitheater acoustics bounced his threats around the empty physical tiers, but Telek could see the outgoing feed telemetry. The bidirectional channel automatically prioritized the audio of the yielded floor. The speaker of the 100 Worlds Compact was currently broadcasting as background noise beneath the calm, methodical resignations of his own empire. Hour 8 bled into Hour 9. The 8th delegate withdrew, then the 9th, then the 10th. Telek felt a cold numbness spreading through his chest. For 19 years, he had operated this machinery under the assumption that it was a one-way mirror. He broadcast power outward. The lesser species absorbed it. The bidirectional channel had been classified in his manual as ceremonial residue, a decorative piece of code meant to look equitable on paper. Now, that residue was severing the arteries of the largest political entity in galactic history. The 12th withdrawal triggered a secondary cascade. Telek's left-hand monitor tracked the live public reaction feeds from 100 planetary plazas. The protocol was to show massive, cheering crowds witnessing the submission of their enemies. The screen displaying the Mathlani Core World Plaza flickered. Rain slicked the cobblestones of the capital city. A crowd of 300,000 citizens stood packed shoulder to shoulder, staring up at the monolithic broadcast screens. Nobody was cheering. Telek zoomed the camera tight on a single face. An elderly Mathlani woman, her iridescent skin muted gray with age, stood holding a soaked synthetic umbrella. She watched the Kaelin delegate resign. She slowly lowered her umbrella. She did not look shocked. She looked exhausted. Behind her, the holographic flag of the 100 Worlds Compact abruptly winked out of existence. The local planetary governor had severed the projection. A red light blinked on Telek's board. Another plaza feed dropped its flag, then another. "They aren't just resigning," Telek whispered. The booth was completely silent now. The protocol officers had stopped hammering on the door. They were slumped against the glass, staring at the feeds. They planned the infrastructure cuts. They synchronized the planetary grids. Hour 11 arrived. The amphitheater air tasted metallic. The speaker was physically panting. His mottled skin had turned an ashen, sickly white. He paced the dais, his heavy footsteps echoing over the channel. He stopped addressing the digital audience and began screaming directly at the ambassador. Whitlock Sarada did not react. She had been standing in the exact same spot for nearly half a day. She simply watched the holographic display cycle through delegate after delegate. A junior technician in Booth 3 knocked a half-empty ration cup off his console. The plastic cylinder hit the deck plating with a sharp clatter. The sound barely registered over the ambient hum of the failing matrix. Down in the amphitheater, the Mothlin Guardian Order moved. 6 massive warriors flanked the speaker's dais. They wore heavy kinetic armor. They had maintained 400 years of absolute, statue-still defensive posture. Their duty was to protect the integrity of the Compact's voice. Simultaneously, without a single verbal command, the 6 guards shifted their ceremonial polearms exactly 1 inch to the left. The synchronized thump of the weapons striking the deck plating echoed through the chamber. It was not an attack posture, it was an at-ease stance. Telek's breath hitched. He zoomed the secondary lens on the squad leader. The guards' ocular sensors were not locked on the human threat. They were watching the live feed from their own homeworld. They were watching their own flag come down. The 24th delegate appeared, a silicon-based entity from the deep core. They spoke in grinding tectonic syllables. They withdrew. The ambassador delivered her third smile. Telic did not wait for the behavioral analysis ping. He glanced at the side monitor. The subroutine was active, but the behavioral team in the lower tier was not logging the data. Telic pulled up their internal booth feed. The three analysts were standing over a single monitor, watching the live feed of the Vorley Coalition Plaza, their own homeworld. They watched their local militia storm the compact embassy on live television. They did not log the human smile. They were too busy watching their universe end. Hour 12, the 34th delegate claimed the screen. The speaker staggered backward. He caught his heel on the edge of the dais step. He did not fall, but his arm jerked wildly. The heavy, synthetic thread of the mantle of the 100 caught on the sharp edge of his own command lectern. 41 years of continuous wear had degraded the fabric. The sudden tension was too much. A loud, audible snap echoed through the speaker's microphone. The right shoulder of the robe tore open. Telic stared at the frayed edges. The robe was woven from 100 threads. 47 of those species had just publicly recalled their allegiance. The physical garment was violently rejecting its own structural integrity. No protocol drone rushed onto the floor to repair it. No tailor stepped from the shadows. The speaker stood with his symbol of authority hanging off his shoulder like a ruined bandage. "You cannot do this," Theln screamed at the human. Saliva sprayed from his lower vocal aperture. "You are one world. You are a probationary observer. You do not have the authorization to dissolve the court." The ambassador finally moved. She shifted her weight to her left foot. "I have dissolved nothing, Speaker," Whitlock Sarada said. Her voice carried no malice. It was the calm, measured tone of a building inspector condemning a rotten foundation. "I simply asked them if they wanted to watch me kneel. You demanded 1,000,000,000 witnesses. You should have asked them first which one of us they wanted to watch fall." The 46th delegate appeared on the screen. It was the Kesari representative again. They did not read a prepared statement. They simply looked into the camera, nodded once to the ambassador, and cut their own feed. The cascade was complete. The bidirectional channel finally closed. The amphitheater plunged into a heavy, suffocating silence. The speaker raised his staff high above his head. He aimed the crystal tip directly at the ambassador's chest, his vocal apertures swelling to deliver a lethal kinetic command. He never delivered it. The squad leader of the Mothlin Guardian Order stepped onto the dais. He did not draw a weapon. He simply reached out with one heavily armored gauntlet and closed his hand over the speaker's microphone array. The acoustic dead drop was physically jarring. The booming, omnipotent voice of the compact was instantly reduced to a muffled, pathetic wheeze. A second guard stepped to the speaker's left. A third took his right. They removed the staff of convocation from his grip. They did not ask for it. They peeled his fingers off the crystal. Telic watched the honor guard forcibly march the trillion-voice speaker down the steps and out the side access corridor. The public disgrace was broadcast in ultra-high definition to the remaining viewers. Telic Voron looked at his master control panel. His hands were completely steady. He bypassed the main feed routing, ignoring the flashing red warning lights of a dozen failed subroutines. He opened his personal, unencrypted audio line and mapped it directly to the universal broadcast outgoing channel. He keyed the microphone. "This broadcast is concluding," Telic said. His professional broadcast cadence was gone. He sounded like a man waking up from a very long, very bad dream. "My name is Telic Voron." Down in the amphitheater, Ambassador Whitlock Sarada looked up at Booth 3. She could not see him through the tinted, reinforced glass. but she was listening. "I would like to request asylum with the Terran Foreign Service," Telek stated, his voice echoing cleanly across the galaxy. "I have served the Compact for 19 years. I have, in the last 14 hours, learned what it is I have been serving. I am no longer willing to do so. Ambassador, thank you." Telek reached up and manually severed the primary power trunk to the broadcast matrix. The amphitheater screens went instantly black. The soft, ambient hum of the translation engine spun down to nothing. Across 100 worlds, 1.2 trillion beings found themselves staring at a gray standby screen. No closing graphics played. No final anthem sounded. The feed simply died. In Booth 3, Telek unclipped his headset and placed it gently on the console. Down in the holding ring, the localized gravity shear deactivated with a soft hiss. The physical constraints evaporated. Ambassador Whitlock Sarada stood alone in the dark, cavernous space. She touched the thin silver chain at her throat one final time. It held no pendant. It carried no emblem of state. It was merely a physical anchor, a quiet reminder of a choice made months ago, light years away, before she ever boarded a ship. She smiled at the empty room. She knelt down. She pulled the zipper of her small synthetic leather case closed. The metal teeth locked together with a sharp, final click. She picked up the handle, turned her back on the empty dais, and walked out of the amphitheater.